Richard Grant had everything that most people could only dream of. He was rich, powerful, and famous across the country. People called him the Steel King because he owned factories, real estate, and companies in almost every city. Wherever he went, people stood up to greet him. Whenever he spoke, others listened. His name was printed in magazines and flashed on television screens. To the world, Richard Grant looked like the man who could never fall, strong, confident, and untouchable. But behind all that wealth and power, there was a truth no one knew. Richard was sick, very sick. It started quietly with a small weakness in his hands. He ignored it at first, thinking it was just stress from work. But soon the weakness turned into pain, and the pain into something far more frightening. He began losing control of his body. His doctors, some of the best in the world, ran tests, gave him medicines, and even flew in specialists from overseas. Yet no one could tell him what exactly was wrong. For a man who had always been in control, this was torture. He wasn't used to hearing the word no. He wasn't used to being told that something was impossible. But now even his money couldn't buy him relief. The illness became worse with each passing week. His body was failing him, and so was his pride. At first, Richard kept his sickness a secret. He didn't want his investors or the media to see him weak. He stopped appearing in public and worked from his home, a massive mansion on top of a hill that overlooked the city he once ruled. Inside that mansion, he lived surrounded by silence, servants, and sadness. Every day he woke up hoping to feel better, but every night he went to bed a little weaker. His reflection in the mirror began to scare him. The confident man in the expensive suits was gone. In his place stood a thin, pale figure with tired eyes and trembling hands. He no longer looked like a billionaire. He looked like a man being eaten alive by his own pain. There were days when Richard couldn't even get out of bed. His doctors tried everything. New drugs, special diets, even experimental treatments that weren't approved yet. Nothing worked. Each failure made him angrier and colder. He shouted at his staff, fired his doctors, and pushed away anyone who tried to help. He told himself that he didn't need sympathy. He needed a cure. But the truth was, Richard was scared. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control what was happening. He couldn't buy health, no matter how much money he spent. He started to realize how lonely he really was. His friends had stopped visiting. His business partners only called to discuss profits. Even his own family rarely came around. They were tired of his temper and pride. The once powerful man who had hundreds of people working under him now sat alone in a dark room, staring at the city lights below, wondering if this was how his life would end. Sometimes, late at night, he thought about the people he had hurt to build his empire, the workers he had underpaid, the families he had forced out of their homes, and the friends he had betrayed for money. Back then, he never cared. He believed that success excused everything. But lying in that big empty mansion, he finally started to see how wrong he had been. All the money in the world couldn't fill the emptiness he felt inside. One evening, as he sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, he whispered to himself, "What's the point of all this if I can't even stand on my own feet?" His voice cracked, and for the first time in many years, tears rolled down his face. His nurse, Clara, was one of the few people who stayed by his side. She cared for him with quiet patience, never afraid of his angry outbursts. She was the one who saw the human side of him that no one else did. She noticed that behind his pride there was a man drowning in fear and regret. "Mr. Grant," she said softly one day, "sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from people." Richard didn't answer, but her words stayed in his mind. They made him think about something he had forgotten a long time ago: faith. Not faith in religion, but faith in life and hope in something bigger than himself. But he wasn't ready to admit it yet. His pride was still stronger than his humility. He told himself he didn't need anyone's help. Yet deep inside, a tiny spark of desperation began to grow. He knew he was running out of time, and if he didn't find a cure soon, his empire would crumble along with his body. That night, as he lay awake in bed, listening to the sound of rain against the windows, he made a silent promise. He would do anything to get better. It didn't matter who he had to turn to or how much he had to pay. He just wanted to live again, what Richard didn't know was that this desperate promise would soon lead him to someone who didn't care about his money or power, and someone who would change his life in ways he could never imagine. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. The sky over Richard Grant's mansion stayed heavy and gray, as if the heavens themselves were mourning him. He spent those days in silence, staring out of his wide glass window, watching water slide down the glass. He hated rain. It reminded him that he couldn't control everything. Inside, the house felt like a museum. The marble floors shone. The grand staircase curved upward like something from a palace, and golden chandeliers sparkled, even when there was no one to see them. Yet for all its beauty, it felt lifeless, just like the man living in it. One afternoon, his nurse Clara walked in quietly with a cup of herbal tea. Richard didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on the raindrops. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, "there's someone I want you to meet." "I don't want visitors," Richard replied, his voice cold and tired. "Especially not strangers," Clara hesitated. "He's not just anyone. His name is Samuel. People say he's helped those doctors couldn't." Richard scoffed. "You mean some village miracle worker? A man with leaves and prayers? I don't pay people to give me hope, Clara. I pay them to fix me." She didn't argue. She just set the tea down and said quietly, "Sometimes help comes from where you least expect it." Then she left the room. For the rest of the day, her words echoed in Richard's mind. Help comes from where you least expect it. He hated that they made sense. That night he couldn't sleep. His body ached as usual, and the medication only made him feel numb. Around midnight, he heard Clara talking to someone downstairs. Her voice was calm and respectful. The man's voice, however, was deep and steady, a kind of peace in his tone that immediately caught Richard's attention. Curiosity, something he hadn't felt in months, made him call out, "Clara, who's there?" A moment later, she appeared at the door with a tall man beside her. He was dark-skinned, dressed simply in a worn coat, and carried a small wooden box. His eyes were kind, the kind that seemed to look right into a person's heart. "Mr. Grant," Clara said, "this is Samuel." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying the man. "So you're the miracle healer," he said with a faint smirk. "Do you take cash or do you prefer gold?" Samuel didn't flinch. "I don't take payment for faith," he said calmly. "I came because I was asked to help." Something about the way he spoke irritated Richard. There was no fear in his voice, no sign that he was impressed or intimidated. Most people trembled in front of him, but not this man. Richard crossed his arms. "You think your prayers and plants can do what the world's best doctors couldn't?" Samuel looked at him quietly. "I don't think, Mr. Grant, I believe. And sometimes belief is stronger than thinking." That sentence hit Richard harder than he wanted to admit. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then in a sharp tone, he said, "Fine, heal me. Do whatever you want. If you succeed, I'll give you anything, money, a house, even a company." He paused, then added mockingly, "No, wait. I'll marry you if you heal me," Clara gasped. "Mr. Grant." But Samuel only smiled faintly. "I don't want your money or your promises," he said. "I just want you to be willing to be healed." The tycoon frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Samuel said gently, "that healing starts inside. If your heart is closed, no medicine will work." Richard stared at him. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not even his doctors. Not his family. Certainly not someone like Samuel, a man with rough hands and calm eyes. "All right, healer," Richard said finally, his pride rising again. "You want to try, then try. But I don't want any magic. Just results." Samuel nodded. "Then I'll start tomorrow." When he left the room, Richard turned to Clara and said bitterly, "He's wasting my time." But deep down, something inside him shifted, a small strange feeling he couldn't name. It wasn't belief, not yet. It was curiosity. The next morning, Samuel returned with a small bag filled with herbs and roots. He prepared a drink and handed it to Richard. The smell was strong, almost unbearable. "This is disgusting," Richard said, making a face. Samuel smiled. "Healing isn't always sweet." For the first time in months, Richard laughed. Just a little, but enough to surprise himself. Over the next few days, Samuel visited daily. He spoke little, worked quietly, and prayed softly under his breath. Sometimes he asked Richard questions, not about his illness, but about his life. Questions no one had ever dared to ask him. Do you ever forgive yourself? Do you believe in love? When was the last time you thanked someone? At first, Richard ignored him. But as the days passed, those questions began to haunt him. He noticed that when Samuel was around, the air in the room felt lighter. The pain didn't vanish, but it seemed easier to bear. One evening, as Samuel was leaving, Richard said, almost without thinking, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Samuel turned and said quietly, "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it either." And before Richard could ask what he meant, the healer walked out into the night rain. That night, Richard lay awake again, not in pain, but in thought. For the first time in his long life, someone had spoken to him not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but simply as a human being. And though he didn't know it yet, that simple encounter had already begun his healing, not of the body, but of the heart. The days turned into weeks, and Samuel's visits became a quiet routine inside the grand, lonely mansion. Every morning he would arrive carrying his old leather bag, filled with strange-smelling herbs and small bottles that clinked when he walked. The servants had grown used to seeing him, the tall, calm man with the soft voice and strong hands. Richard, however, was still fighting himself. He couldn't decide what bothered him more, the illness that refused to leave or the healer who didn't treat him like a king. Samuel never called him Sir or Mr. Grant, he simply said Richard. No one had done that in years. It was as if Samuel didn't care about the billions, the power, or the fame, and that made Richard uncomfortable. One morning, Samuel was preparing a new mixture when Richard snapped, "You've been coming here for 3 weeks and I'm still the same. Maybe you're just another fraud." Samuel didn't respond right away. He finished stirring the bowl, then looked up and said, "Maybe healing takes more than medicine." Richard frowned. "You keep saying things like that. What does it even mean?" Samuel walked closer and said quietly, "It means you don't really want to get better. You want control. You want to win against your illness like it's another business deal. But healing doesn't happen through power. It happens through surrender." Richard's face turned red. No one had ever dared speak to him like that. "Surrender? I don't surrender to anyone," he barked. "Not to competitors, not to failure, and definitely not to some village preacher pretending to be a doctor." Samuel simply smiled. "That's what keeps you sick." Richard clenched his fists. "You think I'm the problem?" "I don't think," Samuel said softly. "I know." For a moment, silence filled the room. The ticking of the old grandfather clock echoed through the hall. Clara, standing nearby, froze, afraid of what Richard might do. Then something unexpected happened. Richard laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. "You're a bold man, Samuel. You stand in my house, insult me, and still act like you're the one in control. Tell me, what do you really want?" Samuel's calm eyes didn't move. "I want you to live. Not just breathe, but live again." Richard stared at him. "And what if I said I'd make it worth your while? Heal me and I'll give you anything you ask for." Samuel shook his head. "I don't heal for reward," Richard smirked. "Everyone has a price." Samuel's voice stayed steady. "Not everyone." Richard leaned forward, his pride pushing through his pain. "All right then. Let's make a deal. You heal me completely and I'll marry you." The words hung in the air like thunder. Clara gasped, dropping the glass she was holding. It shattered on the floor. Samuel didn't move. He simply looked at Richard, his expression unreadable. "Marry you?" Samuel repeated softly. "Yes," Richard said with a bitter laugh. "You say you're not interested in money? Fine. Heal me and I'll prove to the world you were right, that your little miracles work. I'll make you part of my life." "How's that for faith?" Clara whispered. "Mr. Grant, that's enough." But Samuel's eyes stayed calm. "You think faith can be traded like stocks and shares. You don't understand it yet. But I accept your challenge and not your promise." Richard blinked. "You accept?" Samuel nodded. "I'll do what I can. But remember this. If you are healed, it won't be because of me. It will be because you finally allowed yourself to believe." Then he picked up his bag and left the room, leaving Richard speechless. For the rest of the evening, Richard couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. Marry him? Why had he said that? He didn't even understand why the words had come out. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else. A strange need to test the man who refused to bow to him. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at an old photograph of himself from his younger years, healthy, strong, and smiling. He whispered to the picture, "You used to own the world. Now you can't even stand without shaking." He poured himself a drink, but the glass slipped from his trembling hand and shattered. He stared at the pieces on the floor, reflections of himself broken and scattered. As the clock struck midnight, a quiet knock came at the door. It was Samuel again. Still awake? He asked gently. Richard didn't look up. I can't sleep. The pain's worse. Samuel walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the pain grows right before the healing begins. Do you really believe that? Richard asked, his voice trembling. Yes, Samuel said. Because pain forces us to face what we hide. Richard sighed. You talk like a philosopher, Samuel smiled. No. I talk like someone who's seen both sides. Sickness and healing, hate and forgiveness. For the first time, Richard didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. That night, as Samuel prepared another herbal drink, something inside Richard began to shift. He didn't realize it yet, but his walls, the ones he'd built with pride, anger, and fear, were starting to crack. He didn't know whether he'd truly be healed, but for the first time, he found himself listening, not to a doctor, not to a report, but to the quiet voice of faith. And though he would never admit it, Richard Grant, the powerful tycoon who believed he could buy the world, had just met the one man who refused to be bought. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard Grant had ever experienced. His mansion, once a silent museum of wealth, began to feel strangely alive. Each morning the scent of Samuel's herbs filled the halls, earthy, bitter, yet somehow comforting. The servants whispered about him, calling him the man with the calm eyes. To them he seemed like a mystery wrapped in peace. Richard, however, was anything but peaceful. He was a man trapped between belief and disbelief. One moment he felt hope flicker in his chest. The next he crushed it under his pride. He couldn't stand the idea that someone like Samuel, a man without money, fame, or power, might hold the answer to his suffering. Samuel treated him patiently, as always. He never argued, never raised his voice, never showed frustration even when Richard mocked him. Each day he brewed new medicines from herbs, roots, and flowers. Sometimes he prayed quietly while preparing them, his voice so low that it blended with the sound of the boiling pot. Do your prayers actually work? Richard asked one morning, watching him from his chair. Samuel smiled faintly. Not if you don't let them, Richard frowned. So you're saying my healing depends on me, not you? Yes, Samuel said simply. I'm just a tool. You're the one who must decide whether to stay broken or get well. Richard scoffed, but deep down those words made something inside him twist uncomfortably. Later that day, Samuel suggested something unusual. Come outside, he said. Richard raised an eyebrow. Outside? You must be joking. I can barely walk, Samuel nodded calmly. Then walk slowly. Fresh air heals the soul before it heals the body. Clara, standing nearby, looked surprised. Mr. Grant, maybe it will help, she said gently. With an irritated sigh, Richard agreed. It took almost 10 minutes just to get him from his chair to the garden. His legs trembled and every step felt like climbing a mountain. But Samuel stayed beside him, silent, ready to catch him if he fell. When they finally reached the garden, Richard stopped and stared. The grass was wet from the morning dew. Birds chirped in the trees. For the first time in months, he noticed how alive the world outside was. I forgot how quiet nature is, Richard said softly. It's only quiet, Samuel replied, when you stop listening. They stood there for a while, saying nothing. The breeze touched Richard's face, cool and fresh. For a brief moment, he felt lighter, not cured but calmer. But peace never lasted long with him. That night, the pain returned worse than before. He woke up angry, shouting at Clara and throwing his glass across the room. When Samuel arrived the next morning, Richard's temper exploded. You said I was healing, he roared. Look at me. I'm weaker than ever. Samuel didn't move. Healing doesn't always mean feeling better right away, he said softly. Richard slammed his fist on the table. Don't talk in riddles. You promised results. Samuel's calm gaze never wavered. I promised help, not miracles. You can't rebuild a house if you refuse to clear the ruins first. Richard's face went red. You think you're wiser than me? You think you understand pain? You don't know what it's like to lose everything you worked for. For the first time, Samuel's calm voice changed. Not with anger, but with quiet strength. And you don't know what it's like to have nothing to begin with. The room went silent. Clara froze, her eyes wide. Samuel stepped closer. You built your empire by stepping over others. You spent your life chasing power, not peace. And now, when everything slips away, you finally see what really matters, but you still can't admit it. Richard stared at him, speechless. No one had ever dared to talk to him like that. His lips trembled not from illness but from something deeper. Shame. Samuel placed a small bottle on the table. "Drink this today," he said gently. "It will help your body rest. But more than medicine, you need to forgive yourself." Richard whispered bitterly. "Forgive myself? For what?" "For being human," Samuel said quietly. "For thinking you had to be a god." Then he turned and walked out of the room. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The words played over and over in his mind. "You spent your life chasing power, not peace." He wanted to hate Samuel for saying it, but he couldn't, because deep down he knew it was true. He thought of his younger days, how he used to smile more, laugh more, love more. He thought of the friends he'd lost because of greed, the people he'd hurt without caring. And for the first time, he didn't feel angry. He felt empty. Hours passed. The house was quiet. The rain had stopped, and a thin beam of moonlight slipped through the window. Richard sat up slowly, breathing heavily, and whispered, "Maybe I've been sick long before my body failed." The next morning, Samuel arrived as usual. Richard didn't speak at first. He just looked at the healer and really looked at him. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," Richard finally said. Samuel smiled. "That's because I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to remind you that even giants can fall, but they can also rise again." For the first time, Richard didn't argue. He simply nodded. And in that small moment, between pride and humility, between pain and peace, something invisible began to change. Not in Samuel's herbs, not in the medicines, but deep inside Richard's heart. He didn't know it yet, but the real healing had already begun. The night was darker than usual, and thunder rolled across the sky like a warning. Rain crashed against the windows of the mansion, each drop echoing through the silent halls. Richard lay in his bed, breathing heavily, sweat covering his face. His body felt like it was on fire. The pain in his chest pulsed stronger with every heartbeat, as if something inside him was breaking apart. Clara rushed into the room, panic in her eyes. "Mr. Grant, are you all right?" He could barely speak. His voice came out in a whisper. "It's worse. I can't breathe." She hurried to call the doctor, but Richard grabbed her hand weakly. "No doctors," he said. "Just Samuel." She didn't argue. Within minutes, Samuel arrived, soaked from the storm. His simple coat clung to his skin, but his expression stayed calm. He moved quickly to Richard's side, placing his hand over his forehead. "You shouldn't have come in this weather," Clara said anxiously. Samuel looked at her briefly. "Storms don't scare me." Then he turned back to Richard. "But fear, that's the real storm here." Richard tried to speak, but his body trembled. "It's too late." "I'm dying," Samuel's voice was steady. "No, Richard. You're not dying. You're fighting, but you have to stop fighting yourself." The thunder roared louder outside, shaking the windows. The lights flickered, and for a moment the room was swallowed in darkness. Samuel didn't move. He placed both hands over Richard's chest and whispered something under his breath, not in English, but in a soft, rhythmic prayer. His words flowed like music, gentle yet powerful. Clara stood frozen. She had seen doctors operate and machines beep, but she had never seen something like this. A man praying with such peace while chaos raged outside. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Samuel didn't stop. His voice grew fainter, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes stayed shut in prayer. Richard, lying there, felt something strange. The pain was still there, but it wasn't winning anymore. His breathing began to slow. The fire in his chest cooled slightly, like a storm losing its strength. When Samuel finally opened his eyes, dawnlight was breaking through the rain. The night had passed. The storm was gone. Richard lay still, his breathing calm, his face peaceful. For the first time in months, he looked alive. Clara gasped softly. "He's resting," Samuel nodded. His voice was weak but steady. "He's healing." He stood up slowly, his knees shaking from hours of prayer. "Keep him warm," he said. "When he wakes, he'll be different." And then he quietly left the room. Hours later, sunlight slipped through the curtains. Richard woke up slowly, blinking against the light. His body felt sore but lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off him. He looked around, confused. The last thing he remembered was the thunder, the pain, and Samuel's voice. Clara entered the room, her face full of relief. "You're awake," she said softly. Richard sat up slowly. "What happened?" "You nearly passed out last night," she explained. "Samuel stayed here all night. He prayed for you until the storm ended." Richard stared at her, stunned. "He stayed? All night?" "Yes," she said. "He wouldn't leave even when I told him to rest." Richard looked down at his hands. They were still thin and weak, but something inside him felt different. The pain that once ruled his life was quieter now, like an echo fading away. Later that day, Samuel returned. He looked tired but peaceful. Richard didn't speak at first. He just stared at him. Then in a low voice he said, "You didn't have to do that." Samuel smiled. "Yes, I did. Why?" Richard asked. "Why would you risk your life in that storm, for me?" Samuel looked at him and said quietly, "Because every life is worth saving, even one that's lost its way." Those words hit Richard deeper than any medicine ever could. He felt something stir inside him, not guilt, not pride, but something new. Gratitude. "Do you believe I'll recover?" he asked. Samuel nodded. "Your body is healing, but your soul, that's what truly needed to wake up." Richard's eyes softened. "You talk like you've seen this before." Samuel smiled faintly. "I have, in myself." He didn't explain further, and Richard didn't ask. For the first time, he didn't need to know everything. He simply sat in silence, listening to the gentle hum of life outside. Birds singing, leaves rustling, sunlight warming the room. That night, when Clara came to check on him, she found Richard sitting by the window watching the sunset. His expression was calm, his eyes thoughtful. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you think a man like me can change?" She smiled softly. "I think you already have." He looked down at his hands again. They still trembled, but less than before. Maybe, he thought, healing didn't mean being the same again. Maybe it meant becoming someone new. For the first time in years, Richard whispered a simple prayer. Not for wealth, not for success, but for forgiveness and peace. And as he closed his eyes, a quiet tear rolled down his cheek, not from pain, but from relief. Somewhere in the distance, Samuel walked down the long road away from the mansion, the morning sun shining behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that the storm had done its work. It had broken the walls around a hardened heart. The man who once thought healing was something to buy had finally discovered what it truly meant to be healed. The days after the storm were filled with silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the cold, lonely one that used to haunt Richard's mansion, but a peaceful quietness that made him feel alive again. The air seemed lighter, the sunlight warmer, and even the ticking of the old clock sounded softer. For the first time in months, Richard could stand without help. His legs trembled, yes, but they obeyed him. Clara was stunned when she saw him walking slowly around the room, holding onto the wall for support. "Careful, Mr. Grant," she cried, hurrying toward him. He smiled weakly. "It's all right, Clara, I'm not falling this time." She blinked back tears. It was the first smile she'd seen from him in months. Not forced, not sarcastic, but real. Later that morning, Samuel returned as he always did, his bag of herbs slung over his shoulder. When he walked in, Richard was standing near the window, gazing at the garden. "You're up early," Samuel said gently. Richard turned, smiling faintly. "I didn't want to waste the morning." "It feels different today," Samuel nodded. "That's because you're different today." Richard studied him. "You sound sure of that." "I don't have to sound sure," Samuel replied. "I can see it." They both sat down. The healer prepared his usual tea, but Richard stopped him halfway. "I think I don't need as much of that now," he said quietly. Samuel's eyes softened. "No, you don't. Your body's learning to heal itself again." For a while they said nothing. Richard watched the steam rise from the cup and thought about everything that had happened. The storm, the pain, the prayer, the strange peace that had settled inside him since that night. He looked at Samuel and asked, "What did you say that night?" "When you prayed over me?" "I didn't understand the words," Samuel smiled gently. "It wasn't in words you needed to understand. It was a prayer for peace, and not just for your body, but for your spirit." Richard nodded slowly. "It worked," he whispered. "At least, something did." Days passed, and each one brought small miracles. Richard's pain faded, His color returned and the strength in his hands came back. The doctors, when they visited, were speechless. "This is medically impossible," one of them said. "There's no explanation for this recovery." Richard simply smiled. Maybe not everything needs an explanation. Word began to spread among his staff that their employer, the man who was once feared for his temper, had changed. He was polite now, even kind. He thanked people. He listened. He laughed softly when someone made a mistake instead of shouting. One afternoon he called Clara into his study. "You've stayed with me through everything," he said. "You should have left a long time ago." Clara smiled. "I never leave people who still have a chance." He nodded, touched by her words. "Then maybe I should start giving others the same chance." That evening Samuel came to check on him again. Richard was sitting by the fireplace reading a book. He looked stronger, not just in body but in spirit. "You've healed me," Richard said quietly when Samuel walked in. "You did what no doctor could." Samuel shook his head. "No, Richard. I only reminded you of something you'd forgotten. That life is more than control and healing comes when the heart opens." Richard smiled sadly. "Then I owe you my heart." Samuel looked at him seriously. "You don't owe me anything. You owe the truth to yourself." There was a long pause. Then Richard said something that surprised even himself. "I've spent my whole life taking from people. Maybe it's time I start giving back." Samuel nodded. "That's the miracle I've been waiting for." That night Richard walked into his garden under the stars. The air smelled of rain and earth. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was thanking, Samuel, God, or the universe. But it didn't matter. Gratitude was enough. The next morning he called Samuel into his office. "I remember what I promised you," Richard said with a faint smile. "I said if you healed me I'd marry you." Samuel chuckled softly. "I remember." Richard looked down, almost embarrassed. "I meant it as a joke, or maybe as pride. But now I see what it really meant. It wasn't about marriage. It was about trust, about surrender." Samuel smiled kindly. "Exactly. You see now that healing isn't a deal. It's a decision." Richard nodded. "And I've made mine." He reached into his drawer and handed Samuel a folded paper. "What's this?" Samuel asked. "A plan," Richard said. "I'm opening a medical center, a place for people who can't afford treatment. It'll be free for everyone. I want to name it after you, the Samuel Foundation." Samuel froze for a moment, his eyes shining with emotion. "You don't have to do that," Richard smiled. "I know. But I want to." The healer placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe this is your real cure." As Samuel left that day, Richard stood at the doorway, watching him walk down the long driveway. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the man who had everything. He felt like a man who finally understood what everything truly meant. That night, as the mansion lights glowed softly and the wind whispered through the trees, Richard realized something profound. The miracle wasn't that he could walk again. It was that he could finally feel again. The sun rose gently over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Birds sang outside Richard's mansion, and for the first time in years he woke up feeling completely at peace. No pain, no bitterness, no anger, just stillness. The kind that comes after a long storm finally ends. He sat by the window watching the world come alive. The flowers in his garden swayed softly in the breeze. Somewhere far away, church bells rang. He smiled quietly and whispered, "So this is what it feels like to be alive again." When Clara entered the room, she almost didn't recognize him. The man who once shouted orders and threw papers across the room now looked calm, almost humble. His hair, once perfectly styled, was a little messy. His voice, once sharp and commanding, sounded gentle. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she said. "Good morning, Clara," he replied with a smile. "No more medicine today. I don't think I need it anymore." She smiled back, nodding. "You look different, lighter." "I feel lighter," he said softly. "Like I've been carrying a mountain all my life and finally set it down." Later that day, Samuel arrived as usual. But something in his eyes told Richard that this visit would be different. He seemed quiet, peaceful but distant, like someone who knew his work was nearly done. "Samuel," Richard greeted warmly. "I've been waiting for you." "I have something to say." Samuel smiled faintly. "I'm listening." Richard stood up slowly and walked toward him, his step steady and sure. "You remember what I said to you the first day we met?" Samuel's eyes softened. You mean when you promised to marry me if I healed you? Richard chuckled. Yes. Those foolish words. I said them out of pride and out of disbelief. I didn't mean them then. He paused, looking down. But now I realize that promise wasn't about marriage at all. It was a challenge to life itself, to faith, to trust, to surrender. Samuel nodded slowly. Sometimes promises reveal who we truly are, even when we make them in anger. Richard looked up, his eyes shining with gratitude. You taught me that healing isn't about curing a body. It's about curing a soul. You gave me back my life, Samuel, and you asked for nothing in return. Samuel smiled. That's because healing isn't something to be bought or owned. It's something shared. Richard walked to his desk and picked up a small box. He opened it and took out a gold ring, the same one he used to wear when he was at the height of his power. He handed it to Samuel. This ring, he said, used to mean control. It used to remind me that I was untouchable, but now I want it to mean something else. I want it to symbolize gratitude. Not a proposal, not a payment, just a promise that I will live the rest of my life with purpose. Samuel took the ring, his eyes glistening. Then I'll accept it, not as gold but as truth. For a moment they stood there in silence. Two men from completely different worlds, one born with everything, one with nothing, yet standing as equals. Then Samuel said softly, My work here is done. Richard's heart sank. You're leaving? Samuel nodded. You don't need me anymore. You found what you were looking for. Richard shook his head. But you're more than a healer, Samuel. You're my friend. Stay, let me help you for once. Samuel smiled gently. You already have. You listened. Richard wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Samuel was right. Healing had brought them together, but it wasn't meant to bind them forever. Samuel's path was to move on, to bring light to others who still lived in darkness. He followed Samuel outside to the garden, where the flowers glowed under the afternoon sun. The same garden where he had once struggled to walk now felt like sacred ground. Samuel turned to him one last time. Remember what I told you, Richard. Healing begins when the heart opens. Keep it open always. Richard's voice trembled. And if I forget? Samuel smiled. Then look around you. The world will remind you. He reached out his hand and Richard took it. Their handshake wasn't between a patient and a healer anymore. It was between two souls who had saved each other in different ways. As Samuel walked away down the long driveway, Richard stood watching him until he disappeared beyond the gates. The mansion felt quiet again, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that carried peace, not loneliness. That evening, Richard sat in his study, staring at the ring Samuel had left behind on the table. It shone softly in the candlelight. He realized something profound in that moment that the promise had been fulfilled. Not in the way he expected, but in the way life intended. He didn't marry Samuel. He didn't owe him wealth or favors. What he gave instead was something far greater: respect, gratitude, and a new beginning. Richard smiled, whispering to himself, You healed me, Samuel. Not just my body, but everything I lost long before I got sick. And as he blew out the candle and closed his eyes, he felt something deep and unexplainable. Peace that didn't come from medicine, but from meaning. Weeks turned into months, and the mansion that once echoed with silence now carried a new kind of sound: laughter, conversation, and music. The heavy air that used to hang over the place had lifted. The staff walked freely now, smiling without fear. For the first time, the grand house felt like a home. Richard Grant was not the same man the world once knew. The arrogant billionaire, the heartless businessman, the man who thought he could buy health and happiness. That version of him was gone. What remained was a man reborn, gentle but strong, humble but purposeful. He spent his mornings walking through the garden, breathing in the scent of flowers that Samuel once said carried the smell of healing. He would sometimes pause beside the old oak tree and smile, remembering Samuel's words, "Healing begins when the heart opens." Now his heart was wide open. One morning, Clara found him sitting at the dining table, surrounded by papers and blueprints. "Working again?" she asked with a teasing smile. Richard chuckled. "Not the old kind of work. This time I'm building something worth keeping." She leaned over the table, glancing at the designs. Her eyes widened. "Is this a hospital?" He nodded. "Not just a hospital, A place where people who can't afford care can come freely. A place where healing doesn't come with a price tag. Clara's voice softened. You're naming it after him, aren't you? Richard smiled gently. Yes, the Samuel Foundation. For months he worked tirelessly, not out of greed, but out of purpose. The same drive that once built his empire now built hope for others. He sold one of his companies to fund the construction. The media called him crazy. Investors called him foolish. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care what the world thought. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to give back what he had once stolen. Compassion. As the foundation's walls rose higher, Richard often visited the site. He spoke to the workers not as their boss, but as a friend. He ate lunch with them, listened to their stories, and even helped carry small boxes when he could. The workers loved him for it. He's changed, they whispered among themselves. He's not the same man. And they were right. One afternoon, as the building neared completion, a journalist came to interview him. The young woman sat across from him in his office, her pen ready. Mr. Grant, she began, you are known as one of the toughest businessmen in the country. People feared you. What changed you? Richard smiled softly. A man did, he said. A man who taught me that real strength isn't in how much you own, but in how much you give. Is this man still in your life? She asked curiously. Richard looked out the window, his eyes distant. No, he said quietly. He left when I no longer needed him. But his lesson stayed. Sometimes the people who save us aren't meant to stay, where they're meant to show us the way. The journalist lowered her pen. Do you believe what happened to you was a miracle? He thought for a moment, then said, No, it wasn't magic. It was faith. The kind of faith that grows when you finally stop trying to control everything and just let life heal you. His words made headlines the next day. The billionaire who found his soul. But Richard didn't care about fame anymore. All he cared about was making sure the Samuel Foundation opened on time. When the doors finally did, hundreds of people came, children, old men, families who could never afford doctors before. He stood at the entrance with Clara, cutting the ribbon with trembling hands, not from weakness but from emotion. The crowd clapped and tears filled his eyes. He whispered under his breath, This is your work too, Samuel. Inside the new building hung a bronze plaque that read, In honor of Samuel, the man who healed not just a body, but a heart. Every time Richard passed by it, he touched the plaque gently, as if saying thank you all over again. One evening, after everyone had left, he stood in the empty lobby of the foundation. The sun was setting and golden light filled the room. He felt peace unlike anything he had ever known. Clara, he said quietly, do you think he knows what I did? She smiled. If faith is real, then yes, he knows. He looked out the window toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Samuel was probably walking down another dirt road carrying his little bag, helping someone else find their way back to life. Richard's lips curved into a smile. Then maybe one day I'll meet him again, not as a broken man, but as a healed one. That night, as he sat alone in his study, he wrote in his journal, something he had started doing since Samuel left. I used to build towers to touch the sky. Now I build bridges to touch hearts. I thought healing was something to win, but it was something to understand. And the man I once looked down on taught me how to look up again. He closed the journal and whispered, Thank you, Samuel. And in that quiet moment, as the night settled over the city, Richard Grant, the once desperate tycoon, realized that his greatest achievement wasn't his empire, his wealth, or his power. It was his transformation. Years passed. Seasons changed. The world outside moved on, but inside the Samuel Foundation, time seemed to slow down. The hospital had become more than just a building. It had become a heartbeat for the forgotten, a place where hope walked freely through every corridor. The white walls, once empty, now carried laughter, tears, and stories of healing. Children played in the garden while patients shared smiles with nurses. Every corner held a piece of love, the kind that could never be bought. And at the heart of it all was Richard Grant, the man who once lived behind glass towers and golden gates, now spent his days walking through the foundation halls in a simple white shirt, greeting patients by name. He was no longer Mr. Grant to anyone, he was simply Richard. He listened to people's stories. A mother who couldn't afford medicine, a boy who dreamed of being a doctor, an old man who thought his life was over. Richard always listened with the same gentle eyes that once belonged only to Samuel. Sometimes people thanked him, calling him a savior, but he always smiled and said softly, "No, I'm just a man who was healed too." Every Sunday he visited the small chapel at the end of the foundation's garden, a quiet place with wooden benches and a glass window shaped like a sunrise. He would sit there for hours, lost in thought, remembering the man who changed his life forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara joined him there. Her hair had turned silver over the years, but her kindness was the same. She sat beside him and smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, looking at the window. Richard nodded. "Yes. Every time I see the light pass through it, I feel like he's still here, reminding me not to forget who I became." Clara placed a hand on his arm. "You've done more than remember. You've continued his work. You gave thousands of people what he gave you, hope." Richard smiled faintly. "He told me once that pain is just the body's way of calling for love. I never understood that until now. This place, it's love answering back." Clara's eyes glistened. "He'd be proud of you." Richard looked up at the glowing window and whispered, "No. I think he'd just smile and tell me there's still more to do." A few days later, the foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary. People came from all over, doctors, patients, families, everyone whose lives had been touched by Richard's generosity. The event was filled with laughter, speeches, and music. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he stood slowly, holding his notes but never looking at them. He didn't need words on paper. His heart already knew what to say. 10 years ago, he began, this place was just an idea, born out of pain and pride. I thought I was building something for others. But the truth is I built this for myself, because I needed healing more than anyone. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. A man once told me that true healing begins when the heart opens. I didn't understand it then. But now I see that this foundation isn't made of bricks or money. It's made of open hearts, yours and mine. People were silent, hanging on his every word. I was once a man who thought he had everything, he continued, but I was empty inside. Then someone came, someone humble, kind, and wise, and he reminded me what it means to be human again. His name was Samuel. The crowd stirred, listening closely. "I never got to thank him the way I wanted," Richard said softly, "but maybe I just did. Through every life we've helped, every person who's walked through these doors. That's his legacy, and mine." Applause filled the room, but Richard simply bowed his head. A single tear slid down his cheek, not of sorrow but of peace. That night, after everyone had gone, Richard sat alone in the empty hall of the foundation. Moonlight spilled through the windows, casting soft shadows on the floor. He felt tired, but in a peaceful way, the kind of tiredness that comes when a story has finally been told. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Samuel, wherever you are, thank you." For a brief moment, he thought he heard a voice, not from outside, but within him, calm, warm, and familiar. "You finally found your cure?" "Richard," he smiled, eyes still closed. "Yes," he whispered. "I did." The wind blew gently through the open window, rustling the papers on his desk. The gold ring, the same one he had once given Samuel, glimmered faintly in the moonlight. And as the night wrapped around the foundation, the city below slept in peace, unaware that somewhere inside that great building, a man who once tried to buy his healing had instead earned it, through humility, compassion, and love. Years later, when Richard Grant passed away peacefully in his sleep, the world mourned not a tycoon, but a teacher, a giver, a man transformed. At his funeral, Clara read his final note aloud. "To the one who healed me, not with medicine, but with mercy, this life was my thank you." And beneath his name on his tombstone were the words he had lived by in his final years. He found the cure.